I am 80 years old, and my voice trembles when I speak, not because of fear, but because some memories weigh more than the bones that carry them. I have lived long enough to know that silence can grow inside a person like a second heart, one that beats quietly, only for itself. And this silence, mine, has been breathing inside me for more than 60 years. It has slept beside me, eaten with me, aged with me. But tonight, as the lamp flickers and the wind brushes against the window, I feel it's time to let it go, because secrets don't die with us. They stay, they linger in the air, in the faces of our children, in the echoes of what we never said. My story begins before I knew who I was, in a house that smelled of smoke and rain. It was the late 1940s, in a small rural town in the South. The roads were dirt, the nights were long, and people measured time by the sound of the church bell. My parents didn't have much. My father worked long hours at the sawmill, coming home covered in dust and silence. My mother washed clothes for neighbors by the river. We never had shoes that fit right, but we had bread, soup, and the occasional laugh on Sunday evenings when my father played the old accordion. I remember our wooden house, the way the walls cracked in winter, the way the light from the fire danced on the ceiling. And I remember feeling something strange, even then, a sense of emptiness, as if part of me had gone missing before I was even old enough to know what missing meant. I used to wake up at night crying for no reason. My mother would sit on the edge of my bed, stroke my hair, and say, "You're just sensitive, Maria. You feel too much." I believed her. I didn't know then that sometimes the body remembers things the mind has forgotten. When I was 17, the war had ended years before, but hunger still lived in our town like an unwelcome guest. People worked from dawn to dusk and prayed for rain. That was when I started helping at the local market, carrying baskets, washing vegetables, anything to earn a few coins. The market was noisy and alive. I loved the smell of oranges and fresh bread, the rhythm of footsteps on the wooden floorboards, the laughter of women bargaining for a better price. And that's where I met him. Samuel. He was a young man who delivered produce from a nearby farm. He had a quiet strength about him, a calm that drew you in. His hands were rough, his shirt always rolled up at the sleeves, and his eyes, brown and steady, seemed to hold the world still for a moment. The first time we spoke, it was because of an apple. I dropped one from the basket, and it rolled right to his boots. He bent down, picked it up, and said with a smile, "That's good luck, you know, when fruit finds you." It was such a small thing, but that sentence stayed with me. From then on, I waited for Thursdays, the day he brought the deliveries. He started walking me home after work, carrying my basket even though I told him not to. He would talk about the sky, about how the seasons changed the color of the fields, about how silence was never really empty if you knew how to listen. He was not a man of many words, but when he spoke, you wanted to listen forever. He told me once that he had no real family, that he had been adopted as a baby, that the people who raised him had died young. I remember how sad he looked when he said it, and how something inside me ached for him. "I guess I was just meant to find my own people," he said with a half smile. I didn't know it then, but he already had. He had found me. We married a year later, in the small church near the river. It was a sunny afternoon, and the whole town came. I wore a borrowed dress that smelled faintly of lavender, and he wore a suit too big for his shoulders. The floor of the church creaked when I walked down the aisle, and I remember thinking it sounded like the earth holding its breath. After the ceremony, we danced barefoot outside while the gramophone played. We were poor, but it didn't matter. Love made everything seem abundant. We moved into a tiny wooden house at the edge of town, one room, a stove, a narrow bed. When it rained, the roof leaked, and we'd place pots to catch the drops. We'd laugh about it, pretending we were rich people listening to the music of the rain. When I found out I was pregnant, Samuel cried. He said it was the happiest day of his life. He kissed my belly and whispered to the child, "You'll have everything I didn't." But when our son, Elias, was born, he was small and weak. The doctor frowned, said something about his bones, about his spine. He said, "It happens sometimes. Nothing you did wrong." But I could see in his eyes that he didn't believe that. Our second child, Rosa, was born 2 years later. She had a twisted leg and cried without sound, only tears. Then came Daniel, whose heart was too large for his body. And finally, our youngest, Sarah, blind in one eye, delicate as glass. For children, for pieces of my soul, each one born with a burden they never asked for. Samuel never blamed me, but I could feel the question between us, silent and heavy. Why? The town whispered. Some said we were cursed. Others said I had angered God. One old woman even crossed herself whenever she saw me. The priests stopped visiting, and so we lived quietly, almost invisible. Samuel worked longer hours. He'd come home tired, his clothes soaked with sweat, his hands shaking. Sometimes he'd sit outside in the dark and whisper to himself. Once I heard him say, "Maybe we shouldn't have tried again." I didn't know what to answer. I wanted to tell him love was still worth it, that even broken children could be blessings. But the truth was, I was tired too. There are kinds of pain that settle in the bones. Years passed, and our children grew. They laughed, they fought, they played, and though their bodies were frail, their hearts were fierce. They were the reason I kept breathing. One afternoon, I took Sarah to the clinic in town. She was 7, her small hand clutching mine. While we waited for the doctor, I overheard 2 nurses gossiping behind the curtain. One of them said, "That man in room 3, he doesn't even know he has a twin sister. They were separated at birth." I don't know why those words hit me so hard. Maybe it was the way she said it. Maybe it was something older, buried deep. That night, I asked my mother about it. We were in the kitchen, the lamp flickering low. "Did I ever have a twin?" I asked. She froze. Her spoon slipped and hit the floor. And then, after a long silence, she said, "You were never supposed to know." She told me everything. That when I was born, there were 2 of us, a boy and a girl, but we were poor and sickly, and my father said we couldn't feed another mouth. A relative offered to take the boy, raise him far away. They thought it was kindness. They thought they'd done the right thing. But the family never wrote again. They vanished, taking the baby with them. My parents searched for years, but no one knew where he had gone. When she finished speaking, I felt the world tilt. The room spun, and then she said his name, Samuel. I couldn't breathe. I ran outside, the cold air cutting through me like knives. My mind kept replaying everything. The way we looked alike in certain lights, the same birthmark behind the ear, the strange sense of recognition I'd felt the first day I met him. I wanted to scream. I wanted to vomit, but I did neither. I just stood there in the dark, shaking. When I got home, Samuel was sitting by the fire, whittling a piece of wood. He looked up and smiled, his eyes soft, his face lit by the glow of the flames. He looked so innocent, so unaware. I couldn't tell him, not that night, not ever. Days passed. I'd wake in the night and watch him sleep, tracing the curve of his face, wondering how something so pure could turn into something so cruel. We had shared everything, our bed, our laughter, our children, and yet there was a truth between us that could never be spoken. One morning, I decided to tell him anyway. I couldn't carry it alone anymore. I planned to speak that evening after supper, but fate had other plans. He never came home from the mill. There had been an accident. A machine had broken, and he'd been caught in it. They said he didn't suffer. I wish I could believe that. At the funeral, I sat in silence. People whispered prayers, offered condolences, but all I could hear was the pounding of my heart. I leaned over his coffin and whispered, "You were my brother. You were my husband, and I loved you with all I had." He took the truth with him. Maybe that was mercy, because some truths are too cruel for the living. After his death, I became a shadow. I moved through the house like a ghost. The children still needed me, but I felt hollow inside. The days blurred into years. When my mother died, I found a small box in her drawer. Inside was a tag from the hospital where we were born. 2 names written in faded ink, Samuel and Maria, same date, same hour. I burned it that night, not out of anger, but because I couldn't bear for my children to ever find it. They had already carried enough pain. The world didn't need to know what we were. They only needed to remember what we had been. A family, imperfect but full of love. Now I live alone in a small house with lace curtains and photographs that yellow with time. The world outside has changed. There are new machines, new words for old pains. But my memories remain the same. Sometimes, when I wake before dawn, I hear the faint sound of an accordion in the distance. It reminds me of my father, of home, of all the lives that ended before they could begin. And sometimes, I dream of Samuel. In those dreams, he is young again, standing in the sunlight with an apple in his hand. He smiles at me, and I feel no shame, only peace. If there is a place beyond this world where souls find each other again, I hope we meet there. not as husband and wife, not as brother and sister, just as two lost halves finally whole. Until that day comes, I keep his photograph beside my bed. People would call what we had a sin, a tragedy, but I know better. It was love, pure, blind, and cruelly fated. And sometimes, love writes its stories in ways no one can forgive but God. So I whisper to the night, I forgive you, Samuel. And maybe, somewhere, in the dark, he whispers it back,